AITA for becoming the exact person I used to make fun of? Part 1, throwaway account because half the people in this story are famous enough to ruin my career, and the other half would absolutely roast me if they found this. I honestly don't know if I'm looking for advice or forgiveness. A year ago, I would have laughed at anyone who cared about designer handbags, runway shows, or whether a sweater was cerulean instead of just blue. Now, I can identify a pair of $600 heels from across a room. I know which designers are feuding. I instinctively grab coffee orders for people who terrify me. And somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing myself. The worst part? It didn't happen all at once. It happened so slowly that I didn't even notice until the people I loved started asking what happened to me. I kept telling them it was just a job. They didn't believe me. Eventually, I wasn't sure I believed me either. A little background. I had just graduated college. Not fashion school. Journalism. My dream was to write real stories. Politics. Investigative reporting. Something that actually mattered. I imagined myself exposing corruption, interviewing world leaders, maybe winning a Pulitzer if life went ridiculously well. Working for a fashion magazine? Honestly, that sounded like my personal version of hell. Then reality happened. Turns out dreams don't pay rent. Every journalism job wanted experience. Every internship wanted connections. Every editor wanted someone who'd already proven themselves. Apparently, recent graduate with enthusiasm isn't a qualification. So I started applying everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, publishing houses, anywhere that might eventually get me closer to becoming a writer. After enough rejection emails, your standards become surprisingly flexible. Then I got an interview. The company was huge. The position? Junior assistant. The boss? Everyone reacted the exact same way when I mentioned her name. Their eyes would go wide. Then they'd say something like, if she hires you, your career is basically made. Nobody ever followed that sentence with, and you'll probably be happy. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. I still remember walking into the building. Everyone looked expensive, not rich. Expensive. There's a difference. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect posture. Even the interns somehow looked like they belonged on magazine covers. Meanwhile, I was wearing the same sensible outfit I'd worn to every other interview that month. Comfortable shoes. Simple jacket. No makeup worth mentioning. I looked like someone who accidentally wandered into the wrong building while looking for the public library. The receptionist looked me up and down. Not rudely. Almost scientifically. Like she was trying to figure out whether I was lost. Honestly, I would have asked the same question. Eventually, I met the senior assistant, Emily. Imagine someone who treats every second of their day like it's worth $1 million. That was her. She spoke so fast, I spent half the conversation wondering if I'd accidentally skipped a sentence. She kept asking questions that didn't seem to have right answers. Did I know fashion? No. Did I read the magazine? Not really. Did I know who half the designers she mentioned were? Absolutely not. Every answer made her look more horrified. By the end, I was pretty sure she was only continuing the interview because leaving would have taken longer. Then she asked the obvious question. If you know nothing about fashion, why are you here? Fair. I told her the truth. I wanted to be a journalist. This job was supposed to be a stepping stone. 1 year here would open doors everywhere else. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me. Emily stared at me for a second, then laughed. Not because I was funny, because she genuinely couldn't believe I'd said that out loud. A few minutes later, I was taken into the editor's office. Everyone had been talking about her like she was some mythical creature. The kind of person whose arrival changed the temperature in a room. I figured people were exaggerating. They weren't. I knew she'd entered the office before I even saw her. The hallway went silent. Phones stopped ringing. People who'd been chatting suddenly remembered they had work to do. Nobody announced her. Nobody had to. You could literally feel the atmosphere change. That's the kind of presence she had. She barely looked at me. Actually, I'm not even sure she did. She flipped through my resume for maybe 10 seconds. Asked me a couple of questions. Interrupted almost every answer. At one point, she glanced at my clothes with an expression that somehow managed to communicate disappointment, confusion, and mild amusement all at once. I've never felt so thoroughly judged by someone who barely acknowledged my existence. Then she asked why I wanted the job. I gave my prepared answer. Hard worker. Fast learner. Passionate about writing. Ready for any challenge. The usual interview speech. She looked completely unimpressed. Finally, she dismissed me. No smile. No handshake. Nothing. I walked out thinking, well, that was a complete disaster. Emily practically escorted me toward the elevator. I could tell she was already planning interviews with people who actually belonged there. Honestly, I didn't blame her. By the time I got home, I'd already accepted I wasn't getting the job. My boyfriend asked how it went. I laughed. Told him I'd probably become a waitress before someone in fashion hired me. My friends thought the whole thing was hilarious. One of them actually said, "Can you imagine you working for a fashion magazine?" We all laughed. I laughed the hardest. Life has a weird sense of humor. The next morning, my phone rang. They offered me the job. I actually asked if they were sure they had the right number. They were. Apparently, the editor had taken one look at a room full of perfectly dressed applicants and picked the one person who clearly had no idea what she was doing. To this day, I'm still not sure if that was a compliment. Everyone told me the same thing. If you survive 1 year, you can work anywhere. 1 year. 365 days. How hard could it be? Answer. Much harder than I ever could have imagined. Because my first day didn't start with orientation, or training, or even a welcome. It started with discovering that my new boss considered impossible requests completely reasonable. And apparently, failing one of them wasn't an option. So, remember when I thought surviving 1 year would be easy? Yeah, That lasted approximately 5 minutes. I walked into the office ridiculously early because that's what responsible adults do. Turns out, being early doesn't matter when your boss somehow expects you to be ready before you've even arrived. Emily immediately started throwing instructions at me, not explaining them, launching them, coffee orders, phone numbers, meeting schedules, designer names, restaurant reservations. Somewhere around instruction number 37, my brain just gave up and started nodding automatically. I figured I'd learn as I went. Huge mistake. Then everyone froze. Not metaphorically, literally. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People abandoned half-finished coffees. Someone sprinted across the hallway carrying 3 garment bags like the building was on fire. I looked at Emily. She looked terrified. Then she whispered 2 words. She's here. I'd been working there for less than an hour, and somehow my boss's arrival felt like the president walking into a war room. The elevator doors opened. Out stepped Miranda. Perfect coat. Perfect posture. Perfect silence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand attention. She didn't have to. The entire office rearranged itself around her. It was honestly one of the most intimidating things I'd ever seen. She walked straight past me, stopped, looked me up and down, not even subtly. Then, without introducing herself, she handed me her coat. I just stood there, holding it, like an idiot. Nobody had told me I was supposed to take it. Emily rushed over, practically snatching it out of my hands before whispering, "You take the coat." Apparently, everyone knew that except me. Great start. The rest of the morning somehow got worse. Every request sounded simple, until you actually tried doing it. Get coffee. Easy. Except it had to be from one specific place. Prepared one specific way. Ready the exact second she wanted it. Schedule appointments. Simple. Unless the person you're scheduling with is on another continent. Answer phones. Easy. Until 3 people call at once, all insisting they're more important than the last. I felt like I was constantly running, and somehow always behind. Then came my first real interaction with Miranda. She called my name. Actually, she didn't. She called for her assistant. I answered. Walked into her office. She started listing instructions faster than I could write them down. Books. Clothes. Meetings. Drivers. Lunch. Flowers. Something about a designer flying in from Europe. I nodded the entire time. Not because I understood. Because I physically couldn't interrupt. When she finally stopped, she looked at me, waiting. I smiled. She asked, "Well." I panicked and admitted I hadn't caught all of it. She stared at me for a second, then repeated absolutely none of it. Instead, she just looked disappointed, which somehow felt worse than yelling. That became a pattern. She almost never raised her voice. She didn't need to. One look from her could make grown adults question every decision they'd made since childhood. I started measuring my mornings by how many disappointed expressions I received before lunch. Some days, I hit double digits. Emily wasn't much help. Actually, that's not fair. She was helping, just in the way people help by throwing you into the deep end and assuming you'll figure out swimming before you drown. Every mistake I made somehow became proof I never belonged there. Wrong coffee? My fault. Late delivery? My fault. Designer cancels a meeting? Somehow. Also my fault. I genuinely wasn't sure whether I was bad at my job, or if the job itself was designed to make people cry. Speaking of crying, I got surprisingly close. More than once. One afternoon Miranda asked for a manuscript. Not a manuscript. A very specific manuscript that apparently hadn't even been published yet. She wanted it for her daughters. That evening. Like this was a perfectly normal thing to ask. I remember standing there thinking, surely she doesn't actually expect me to get an unpublished book. She did. Every person I called basically laughed. Publishers, editors, bookstores. Nobody had it, because, again, it wasn't available. When I finally admitted defeat, Miranda looked at me like I'd personally invented failure. She didn't insult me. She just quietly moved on to the next task. So, that hurt more. By the end of my first week, I was exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally. I barely saw my friends anymore. My boyfriend kept asking how work was going. I always gave the same answer. It's fine, which is the universal phrase for, everything is on fire, but I don't have enough energy to explain why. One night we all went out for dinner. For the first time in days, I actually relaxed. We joked around, complained about our jobs, laughed. Then my phone rang. Miranda, of course. I excused myself, answered immediately, because I'd already learned one very important lesson. You don't ignore Miranda, ever. She needed something, immediately. I said yes before she even finished explaining. When I came back, everyone was staring at me. One of my friends laughed and asked, "Does she own you now?" I laughed too, mostly because I didn't have a better answer. Things finally boiled over after one particularly disastrous day. Nothing had gone right. Every task somehow turned into another failure. Miranda called me into her office, closed the door, then calmly explained that hiring me had been a mistake. She told me she'd taken a chance on someone who seemed intelligent, someone different. Instead, I turned out to be just as disappointing as everyone else. I stood there trying not to cry. I honestly believed I was about to be fired. Instead, she simply dismissed me, like I wasn't even worth being angry at. I walked straight out of her office, into the hallway, and kept walking until I found the only person who looked remotely approachable. Nigel. If you've never met someone who can insult you and encourage you in the exact same sentence, that's Nigel. I told him I didn't know what I was doing wrong, that I was trying, that nothing seemed good enough. I expected sympathy. Instead, he absolutely destroyed me. He basically said, "No, You're not trying. You're complaining.
Ouch.
Then he pointed out something I'd been refusing to admit. Everyone else in that building would have done almost anything for my job. They lived for fashion, dreamed about working there. Meanwhile, I'd been treating it like a temporary inconvenience, a stepping stone.
To them.
That wasn't humility. It was disrespect. And honestly, for the first time since I'd started, I realized he was right. Not about everything, but about enough. I'd walked into their world, convinced it didn't matter, then acted surprised when nobody respected me. I looked at Nigel and admitted something I'd been too stubborn to say before. I don't want to fail. Not anymore. Then I asked him for help. Real help. The kind that couldn't be learned from a notepad or an employee handbook. He sighed, looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone about to completely dismantle your life. He told me to follow him. I had absolutely no idea. I was about to walk into a closet that would change far more than just the way I dressed. So, Nigel told me to follow him. I assumed we were going to some storage room where he'd explain office politics or give me a motivational speech. Instead, he took me into what I can only describe as the most intimidating closet on earth. Rows and rows of designer clothes. Shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Bags sitting on shelves like museum pieces. I honestly felt like I should have paid an admission fee just to look around. Nigel glanced at my outfit, then looked back at me, very politely, very professionally. He basically said, "We need to fix all of this." Fair enough. At that point, even I couldn't defend my wardrobe. A few hours later, I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. The frizzy hair?
Gone.
The shapeless sweaters?
Gone.
The sensible shoes I'd been clinging to like a security blanket? Definitely gone. I looked confident. Or, at least like someone pretending to be. Funny how much of confidence comes from believing everyone else thinks you belong. The next morning, I walked into the office. People actually looked up. Not because I'd spilled coffee. Not because I'd messed something up. They were looking at
me.
Emily stopped mid-sentence. She blinked twice, then casually said, "Well, that's different." Which, coming from her, was basically a standing ovation. Even Miranda noticed. She didn't compliment me. Of course she didn't. She simply looked me over for half a second, then kept walking. That tiny moment somehow felt like I'd won Employee of the Month. It's embarrassing how quickly your standards change. The weird part wasn't the clothes. It was how people treated me. Security guards smiled. Designers remembered my name. People who'd ignored me last week suddenly assumed I knew what I was doing. I hadn't magically become more capable overnight. I just looked like I belonged. That realization was uncomfortable. I started learning faster after that. Not because the clothes made me smarter. Because people finally stopped assuming I was clueless before I opened my mouth. Nigel taught me designers, fabrics, collections, the history behind brands I'd spent my whole life making fun of. And honestly, the more I learned, the harder it became to dismiss the industry as superficial. These people weren't just making clothes. They were creating art, an incredibly expensive form of art, but art nonetheless. One afternoon, I made the mistake of calling two belts basically identical. Miranda happened to overhear. She slowly turned toward me. I immediately knew I'd said something stupid. She picked up one of the belts, then the other. Without raising her voice, she explained exactly why they weren't the same. The designers, the collections, the influence, the craftsmanship. How trends that seemed meaningless eventually filtered into every store in the country, including the cheap sweaters I'd probably worn to my interview. She wasn't talking about fashion anymore. She was talking about influence, about culture, about how people convinced themselves they're making independent choices, when those choices were shaped years earlier by people they'd never even heard of. I just stood there, because for the first time, I realized I'd been judging an entire industry without understanding any of it. Around that time, something strange started happening. I got good, not perfect, but good enough that Miranda stopped correcting every tiny mistake. Coffee was ready before she asked. Flights were booked. Meetings rearranged. Packages appeared exactly where they needed to be. Eventually, I stopped reacting to impossible requests. She'd say, "I need a car in 12 minutes." I'd already be dialing the driver. It was like my brain had been completely rewired. The downside? My personal life started falling apart. Again, I missed birthdays, dinner plans, movie nights. Anything scheduled more than 24 hours in advance was basically a suggestion, because Miranda could call at any moment. And when she did, everything else disappeared. My boyfriend tried to be understanding. He really did. But there's only so many times someone can hear, "I'm sorry, work came up," before they stop believing it's temporary. One night we had plans we'd been looking forward to for weeks. Reservation booked. Friends meeting us there. I was actually on my way. Phone rings. Miranda, of course. She needed me immediately. I looked at my phone, then at the restaurant, and turned around. By the time I arrived at the office, I realized I'd made that decision almost automatically. I didn't even debate it. That scared me more than the job itself. When I finally got home, my boyfriend was still awake. He didn't yell. Honestly, I wish he had. Instead, he just asked, "Are we ever going to come first again?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because I genuinely didn't know the answer. Things weren't much better with my friends. Every conversation somehow turned into work. I'd accidentally started talking like everyone at the magazine. Deadlines, collections, designers, travel schedules. One of my friends finally laughed and said, "You know, you sound exactly like the people you used to make fun of." Everyone laughed, including me, but it stuck with me, because deep down, I knew she was right. Then Emily got sick. Really sick. She'd spent months preparing for Fashion Week in Paris. Months. She knew every designer, every seating chart, every event. Going to Paris with Miranda wasn't just a work trip. It was the reward she'd been chasing for years. Then, food poisoning, or the flu, or both. She could barely stand. The office immediately shifted into crisis mode. Everyone knew what was coming. The question wasn't whether someone else would go. It was, who? I didn't even consider myself an option. Why would I? Emily had earned it. I was just there. A couple of days later, Miranda called me into her office. She looked up from a stack of papers, completely calm, then casually informed me that I'd be accompanying her to Paris. I actually thought she'd misspoken. I waited for her to correct herself. She didn't. I left her office feeling excited for about 10 seconds. Then reality hit. Emily. I found her at her desk. She already knew. Of course she did. News traveled faster than Wi-Fi in that building. She looked absolutely devastated. Not angry. Heartbroken. She'd sacrificed everything for that opportunity. Now, it was mine, because she'd gotten sick. I tried explaining that it wasn't my decision. She didn't disagree. She just quietly said, I would have done anything for this. I believed her. That somehow made it worse. That night, I packed my suitcase. Instead of feeling successful, I felt guilty, because somewhere between trying not to get fired and actually becoming good at my job, I'd started winning. And every victory seemed to come at someone else's expense. Emily, my friends, my boyfriend, even myself. I kept telling myself it would all be worth it. I just wasn't entirely sure what it was anymore. The next morning, I boarded a plane to Paris with one of the most powerful women in publishing. I thought the hardest part of this job had been surviving New York. I was wrong, because Paris wasn't where my career peaked. It was where I had to decide exactly how much of myself I was willing to trade for success. So, Paris, the city everyone dreams about, the city of romance, art, fashion, tiny coffees that somehow cost more than lunch. I barely saw any of it, because Fashion Week isn't a vacation. It's controlled chaos. The second we landed, everything became a blur. Hotels, showrooms, designers, last-minute schedule changes, people speaking 3 different languages while somehow still expecting me to solve every problem. Miranda moved through all of it like she'd already lived this exact week 100 times. Nothing surprised her. Nothing impressed her. Nothing slowed her down. The rest of us were sprinting just to keep up. I'd never seen someone command so much respect. Actually, respect isn't even the right word. Fear. Admiration. Dependency. Everyone wanted something from Miranda. Designers wanted her approval. Editors wanted her opinion. Models wanted to be noticed. Executives wanted 5 minutes of her time. She barely acknowledged any of it. She just kept walking. At first, I thought she was cold, but the longer I worked for her, the more I realized something. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She simply refused to waste time pretending everyone deserved her attention. If she gave you 5 minutes, you'd earned it. Harsh? Definitely. Effective? Unfortunately. Also yes. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Friends texting. My boyfriend calling. Voicemails piling up. I kept telling myself I'd answer later. After the next meeting. After dinner. After tomorrow. There was always another after. Eventually, I stopped checking altogether. One evening, after another 16-hour day, I finally called my boyfriend. He answered immediately. For a second I smiled. Then he asked, so, are you finally done choosing work over everyone else? Not exactly the reunion I'd imagined. I tried explaining. Told him this opportunity could change my career forever. That it wasn't permanent. That I just needed him to understand a little longer. He went quiet. Then he said something that completely caught me off guard. I don't even recognize you anymore. That one hurt, because it wasn't said to be mean. It was said because he genuinely believed it, and if I was being honest, part of me wondered if he was right. We argued, not screaming. Honestly, those are easier. This was worse. It was 2 people slowly realizing they weren't living the same life anymore. By the end of the call, we were both silent. Then, he hung up. I stood there staring at my phone, wondering when exactly we'd started becoming strangers. I wish I could say work distracted me. It didn't. If anything, it got more intense. One morning I walked into Miranda's suite and immediately knew something was wrong. She wasn't angry. She wasn't giving orders. She was quiet. Almost too quiet. That's when I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The people who smiled at her in public rolled their eyes the second she turned away. The executives praising her were having private meetings without her. Everyone wanted something. Nobody seemed loyal. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She looked alone. Then Nigel found me. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him. He finally got the news he'd been waiting years for. A huge promotion. Creative director at another fashion house. Better title. Better money. More freedom. Honestly, I was happier for him than he seemed to be for himself. He'd earned it. Nobody deserved it more. Then, everything changed. Rumors started spreading through the event. People whispering. Executives disappearing into private meetings. Nobody would explain anything, which usually means something very bad is happening. Eventually, I overheard enough to piece it together. The company wanted change. They were planning to replace Miranda. After everything she'd built, they were ready to move on. Just like that. Corporate loyalty really is a myth. I assumed she didn't know. She did. Of course she did. Miranda always knew. She just never reacted until she had a plan. The next day, we were heading to one of the biggest events of Fashion Week. Everyone expected some dramatic announcement, including me. Instead, Miranda calmly walked into the room and completely changed the game. She made one phone call, had one conversation, pulled a few invisible strings. By the end of the afternoon, the executive's entire plan had collapsed. The person who lost everything? Nigel. His promotion disappeared overnight. The position he'd been promised was suddenly gone because Miranda had sacrificed his opportunity to save her own. I couldn't believe it. I confronted her afterward. Probably the bravest or dumbest thing I'd done all year. I asked how she could do that to someone who'd been loyal to her for years. She looked at me, completely calm. Then she said something I'll never forget. Basically, everyone wants this life. The prestige, the influence, the power. But nobody likes the decisions required to keep it. Someone always pays the price. This time, it wasn't going to be her. I walked away furious. Not because she'd protected herself. Because she'd done it so effortlessly. Like sacrificing someone else's dream was simply another meeting on her calendar. Then she looked at me and quietly added, "You already made the same choice." I stopped. She reminded me of Emily, Paris, my boyfriend, my friends, every person I'd slowly pushed aside while convincing myself it was temporary. I'd spent months judging Miranda, without noticing I was slowly becoming her. Different scale, same decisions. Work first, people later. Always another excuse. That was the moment everything clicked. This job hadn't changed me overnight. It had changed me one compromise at a time. One missed dinner. One ignored phone call. One broken promise. One promotion. One opportunity. Until eventually, I couldn't remember where the line had been. The next morning, I was sitting beside Miranda in the back of the car as we drove through Paris. She started talking about my future. Said I had what it took. Said I could become exactly like her someday. A few months earlier, I would have taken that as the greatest compliment imaginable. Now, it felt like a warning. I looked out the window, thought about my friends, my boyfriend, Nigel, Emily, the person I'd been before all of this. Then, without saying a word, I made a decision that probably looked completely insane. I opened the car door at the next stop, set my phone down on the seat, and walked away. No dramatic speech. No argument. No goodbye. I just left. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally hear my own thoughts again, but I had no idea whether I'd just saved my life or thrown away the biggest opportunity I'd ever have. So I walked away. No backup plan. No dramatic announcement. I just left my phone on the seat, stepped out of the car, and disappeared into a city where I barely spoke the language. For the first time in almost a year, nobody knew where I was. And honestly, it felt amazing. The funny thing is, I expected to feel panic. Instead, I felt relief. My phone wasn't vibrating every 30 seconds. Nobody was demanding impossible favors. Nobody was asking me to somehow bend space and time because they wanted a steak before a meeting. It was just quiet. I'd forgotten what quiet sounded like. I wandered around Paris for hours, actually looked at the buildings, sat at café, watched people argue over tiny cups of coffee. For months I'd been in the fashion capital of the world, without actually seeing it. Turns out when you're constantly chasing the next task, you stop noticing where you are. Eventually reality caught up with me. I still needed a job. Rent still existed. Student loans definitely hadn't disappeared. Walking away felt incredible, but adulthood has this annoying habit of sending invoices. So I flew home. No clue what came next. The apartment felt different, smaller somehow. Or maybe I was different. My boyfriend and I sat down to talk. Really talk. No phones. No interruptions. No pretending everything was fine. We both admitted we'd been unhappy for a while. Not because either of us was a terrible person. We were just moving in different directions. Sometimes love isn't enough if your lives stop fitting together. That realization sucks. But pretending otherwise would have sucked even more. So, we ended things. No screaming. No dramatic scene. Just two people accepting that they'd become strangers while trying really hard not to. I cried after he left. A lot. Success doesn't feel nearly as impressive when there's nobody left to celebrate it with. A few days later, I got a call. One of the newspaper editors I'd interviewed with months earlier wanted to meet. Apparently someone had recommended me. Strongly. I assumed Nigel had pulled some strings. Or maybe one of the contacts I'd made. I honestly had no idea. The interview was weirdly relaxed. No one cared whether I could identify a designer handbag. Nobody asked about seating charts. They wanted writing samples, ideas, questions, things I'd almost forgotten I love talking about. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Near the end of the interview, the editor smiled. He held up a recommendation letter, then said something that completely caught me off guard. "You must have really impressed her." I frowned, asked who he meant. He looked confused, then casually mentioned Miranda. Miranda? Apparently she'd personally recommended me. Not because I'd stayed, because I'd left. That completely broke my brain. After everything, after all the impossible demands, after I literally abandoned her in Paris, she still opened the door I'd wanted all along. It didn't make sense until I thought about it. She'd never wanted another assistant. She wanted someone capable of surviving her world. I'd survived. Then I'd chosen a different one. Maybe that was exactly why she respected me. A few weeks later I started my new job. Writing. Actually writing. Not fetching coffee. Not tracking down impossible manuscripts. Writing. Every time I sat down at my desk, I remembered the terrified girl who'd walked into that fashion magazine convinced she was above the industry. Funny. I wasn't above anything. I was just ignorant. Looking back, people always ask me the same question. Were those people really that obsessed with fashion? Honestly, no. Not really. They were obsessed with excellence. Fashion just happened to be their language. Once I understood that, I stopped laughing at them. You don't have to love someone's passion to respect the discipline behind it. As for Emily, I ran into her months later. I fully expected her to hate me forever. Instead, she rolled her eyes, made a sarcastic comment about me disappearing, and eventually laughed. Not immediately. It took time. but eventually, we were okay. I don't think either of us ever forgot Paris. We just learned to move past it. Nigel, that one was harder. He lost an opportunity he'd spent years earning. I still feel guilty about the way everything unfolded, but he also reminded me of something important. People like him don't build careers because of one promotion. They build them because they're talented. One setback doesn't erase that. If anyone was going to recover, it was him. And Miranda? I saw her one last time.
Completely by chance.
We were walking toward each other on opposite sides of the street.
She noticed me.
For 1 second, our eyes met. I smiled. She didn't. At least, not obviously. She gave the tiniest nod, almost invisible, then got into her car and drove away. That was it. No heartfelt goodbye. No emotional speech. Honestly, anything more would have felt wrong. Some relationships don't end with closure. They end with mutual understanding. So,
Heck,
Ida, was I wrong for letting a job consume my entire life, even if it helped me become better at what I loved? Or was walking away the smartest decision I ever made? Because here's the weird part. I don't regret taking the job. Not for a second. It pushed me harder than anyone ever had. It taught me discipline, confidence, how to perform under pressure, how to stop making excuses. But I also don't regret leaving, because somewhere along the way, I realized there are two different kinds of success. The kind everyone else applauds, and the kind that lets you sleep at night. I finally understood they aren't always the same thing. And if I learned anything from that year, it's this. Never become so focused on building the life you want that you accidentally destroy the life you already have. Clapperboard movie reveal. This story was actually the plot of The Devil Wears Prada. Could you guess the movie before the reveal? If you enjoyed this Reddit-style movie retelling, subscribe to Narrophile and comment which movie you'd like me to rewrite next, or suggest an alternate ending, and it might be